Okay, so I know what many of you are probably already thinking, and that's that so many of the great pioneering jungle and drum and bass producers didn't really have any music theory knowledge, so why do I, and what's the point of me watching this video? Jungle is actually quite a unique genre where so much of the production is based on creativity and instinct rather than any formal music theory knowledge. And it shares a lot of similarities with other genres like hip hop, sample-based hip hop, where almost all of the producers are self-taught.
Affordable computers have opened up music making to a new generation and revolutionized the creative process.
Technology's been the most important thing because without people being able to go out and just spend a couple of grand on a computer and a sampler, then they couldn't there's no other way of laying down the music. You got to go and sort of a big studio or do this and do that. So technology's been the main sort of reason why people can go out and do what they're doing now.
An understanding of sampling records and chopping up drum breaks and distorting bass lines is just as valuable, if not more, to artists trying to learn to make jungle than having an in-depth knowledge of music theory. Even though music theory isn't actually essential to making jungle and drum and bass, there are a few insights and tips and tricks I've picked up along the way that I thought would be really valuable to share in this video today. In order to understand some of the concepts we're going to tackle later on in this video, I think it's pretty important just to understand the framework and some of the basics of music theory. So I'm going to cover that very briefly now, but if you want a more detailed explanation, I suggest checking out this guy called Guy Michael Moore, who's got a really good video on YouTube going over many of the same things. Okay, so here we have a keyboard, and what this is essentially made up of is 12 notes that repeat as we jump up and down the keyboard. So we go C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, and then back to C. And this is an octave from this low C to this high C, and we can go up another one here. So it's just these repeating patterns of 12 notes. These notes are then combined in different ways to make scales, and two of the most common scales you've probably all heard of are the major and minor scales. Now, to make C major, it's literally all the white notes from C up to C, so we can just go. That's the C major scale, and the A minor scale is also all the white notes, but this time we started at A. In order to find which of the 12 notes here are actually in our scale, we apply a formula, and this is different for all the scales. So for the major scale, there's a specific formula, and for the minor scale, there's a different formula. So for the major scale, it's a whole step. Starting on C, we go a whole step, and then another whole step, missing out these two black notes here, and then a half step, and then a whole step, a whole step, whole step, half step. And for the minor scale, we go whole step, and then we go half step. Whole step, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step. So essentially, the way to make scales from the 12 notes in the keyboard is to apply a formula which picks 7 notes out of them. Now, what's one more interesting thing to quickly touch on here is the C major here and the A minor have all the same notes, which is essentially all the white notes. And these are called relative major and minor scales. And this is an important concept to remember for later. Now, even though the vast majority of music we listen to these days, and about 95% of electronic music is built using just the major and minor scales, I just want to quickly paint a picture of how vast the world of scales is. And in music, we have all these modes. So there's 7 different modes in Western classical music, of which major and minor are a part of. But if we go bigger than that, there's Egyptian scales and traditional Japanese scales, and almost every continent and many of the countries in the world have produced scales over their lifetimes of the birth of humanity till now. So there is an unbelievable breadth to the amount of scales out there. Now, in amongst these scales, there's also different tunings to make things even more complex, and most people in Western music, apart from maybe if you're Jacob Collier, will use something called equal temperament, where we split the octave up into each note difference is 100 cents difference from the next one, which is equal to a semitone. But actually, a lot of these other cultures will use different ratios. Everything's actually based in mathematics for this. They will use different ratios to find out how many notes there are in their scales and their relationship to one another. And there's a whole bunch of different tuning systems in the world. So not only are there different scales, but there are different tuning systems. So it becomes incredibly complex and actually very interesting to dive into, which is maybe for another tutorial. But I just wanted to show you the vast world of scales and tunings out there, and then we're going to bring it back to the major and minor scales, which is going to be the focus for the rest of this video. The last thing to quickly touch on in this basic section is chords, and chords are very simply 3 or more notes played at the same time. So we can play a C major triad here, which is a 3-note chord, but we can add more notes to make the chords more complex, and then we can combine different chords together to make a chord progression. Now, I probably could have explained some of this a little bit slower and gone a little bit deeper into some of these topics like other YouTubers have doing similar style videos, but that's not really the point of this tutorial. I'm here to show you how we can specifically apply some of this knowledge to making jungle music.
Easy does it, make it easy.
So a second ago we talked about chords, and now I want to introduce you into parallel chords. Now what parallel chords are is taking a chord like this C major 7th chord, and then I have this chord mode where if I put chord on here on my keyboard and I press these notes, I can essentially play the chord now just by pressing one note on the keyboard. So what a parallel chord is taking that exact structure of the chord, the way it's been voiced up the keyboard, and then transposing that up or down. Now these are really interesting because one thing, they sound very jungly. If I do this with like a pad sample, might be a better thing to show you. You can instantly hear that jungle sound coming through. So you can hear that it has a bit of that classic rave sound to it, and the reasons for this are actually twofold. Firstly, a lot of keyboards, actually I think the Jupiter 4 might be one of the first ones to introduce this in the late 1970s and early 80s. A lot of keyboard manufacturers started to include a chord function just like this keyboard has here. But actually the second reason is to do with sampling. And so what happens is if I record out one of these 7th chords here, quantize that so it comes through quickly, and bounce this audio down, I now have a sample of that chord. And if I load the quick sampler in Logic here, and then I load that sample into the sampler, I take all this chord stuff off, so I'm just playing one note. Now I'm playing this chord in the sampler, but if I pitch it up and down, you can see the same thing is happening. I'm pitching that chord up and down, the sample of the chord this time. So actually when artists, with the birth of the sampler in the 80s and 90s, the hardware sampler, when artists would take chords from other people's tracks or from sample CDs or sample their own chords and play them in the samplers up and down, you would get this effect of these parallel chords being pitched up and down. Now the interesting thing about parallel chords, and something that can be really confusing when you first start out, is even though the formula of the note is going to stay the same, if I play this C here, we're playing this C major 7 chord, as I transpose this up and down the keyboard, we're going to drift into different scales. So if I clear this, you can see I'm now playing in a C sharp major, so I've gone to a completely different scale when I've pitched this up and down the keyboard, and that can be one reason why it's really hard if you're trying to add parallel chords to a track to make them fit right, because you're going to be bringing in lots of notes from different scales. Another thing that can be really challenging is if you've actually built your track on pitching around a sampled chord or using parallel chords, because quite often you'll be drifting into different keys, so the harmony of the track will be changing every bar or so. And the answer to this is all the rest of the ingredients have to move as well. So your bass has to move and all your melodic instruments have to move to fit the new key that the pad is moving to. And a good example of this is a song I was listening to quite recently called Fast Floor, the entitled one, which is just a nice rolling jungle tune, but I think it illustrates this point really well. So this essentially brings me to the crux of this whole video and the thing I'm really trying to explain here. And that is that samples are just like chords and behave the same as parallel chords when we pitch them up and down. So let me explain. If I take a triad this time, so if I take a C major triad, and then I bounce that down into a sample and load that sample into a sampler, what happens is, if we look at mixed in key here, if I now play this root note of C, and then I play +5 semitones, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 up, play an F, or +7 semitones from C, play a G. Interestingly, looking at mixed in key here, what we've got is all of the white keys going up and down the keyboard. So what this is really about is something called the circle of fourths and fifths, and this is probably the most useful tool I find in the whole of music theory. And what it is these are all the major keys around the top and all the minor keys around the middle. And what it's showing us in essence is the similarity of these keys to one another. And so this C, the difference between the C and the G is only one note different. So the G has an F sharp, I think it is. And the difference between the C and the F is only one note different. So by playing this C note here and then going 5 semitones up or 7 semitones to either the G or the F, we unlock, we're playing keys that are very similar to our root key of C. And we can also go down 5 and 7 semitones. Now, one other thing, we can also go up an octave. So we can go C an octave higher, and F and G an octave higher. So you can play with this all the way up and down the keyboard, these fourths, fifths and octaves. Now this I'm just doing with a chord sample, but the same thing applies with just a sample from a record like this one here. If I pitch this up now, if I clear mixed in key, so we're in E minor, and if I go up, we're still in E minor, up to a G. So you will have some extra notes that come in, especially when you're doing samples. This isn't like a strict science, because of the way the samples, all the chords have been made up. By pitching them up and down, you will bring in some notes that are not in your scale. But the idea is that you're pitching up and down to scales that are closest to the one you're in. So how is this useful? Well, this is really handy when you're trying to add samples to a track. And if I based my sample, say my track started with this actual pad here, and I was trying to match my tane sample to it, what I can do is, I know that's in C major. Now what's interesting is this tane sample was actually in the minor key. So what I could do is look at this and go, okay, I need to get to a major key, but the relative major minor here is A minor. So A minor has all the same notes as C. So I could try pitching from E minor, which is what my sample is in, pitch this to be an A minor, and then that should have all the same notes as C. So the way to do this is I need to pitch this. If I imagine it's an E, I've got to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 semitones up to get to an A. So I can come into this sample and pitch it up 5 semitones, and now we've got an A minor sample, which will actually have the same notes as this this chord. Now, even though the samples maybe don't match perfectly, there are some things that affect whether samples gel together or not, like their tonality and the instruments in them and their vibe and theme beyond just the notes that are in them. But what we can clearly see is they're both fitting perfectly in the scale of A minor. Now that we've got them both locked to the scale of A minor, we can try pitching them up and down to see if any other variations work. So maybe I pitch this one down 7 semitones just to see if the pad works at a lower register. It's actually not bad down there. I could pitch the pad up an octave from that point. Which sounds kind of cool. I could go, maybe I go up to 7 semitones from there. So you can hear all of these different variations are working. You can use the +5 semitones, or +7, plus an octave, or obviously the same minus, and find lots of different variations with samples to make them fit with your song key. And that's really it for me today. So I hope this has been a useful little insight into some music theory and how you can apply it to adding samples to your tunes. And I will catch you very soon in the next one. Peace.